When we view the international arena from the position of realism, we must discard all sentimentality and liberal rhetoric regarding values and international law. Geopolitics is a harsh game of great powers, where the key factor is force, and the primary goal is survival. The situation surrounding the city of Lviv in 2026 represents a classic example of how the logic of an anarchic international system drives a state toward decisive and extremely dangerous actions. To understand why Lviv has become the epicenter of a global standoff, we must analyze the interests of the key players: Russia, the United States of America, which I will call the US, and regional forces such as Poland. From the perspective of offensive realism, great powers always strive to maximize their share of global power and, ideally, dominate their region. Russia, under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, has for decades made it clear that the expansion of NATO and the transformation of Ukraine into a Western bastion on its borders is an existential threat. In 2026, this dynamic has reached its logical apogee. Lviv has ceased to be merely a city in the west of Ukraine. It has turned into a critical logistical hub through which 90% of Western military aid passes. For Moscow, this means that as long as Lviv functions as the gateway to the west, the conflict in the east can continue indefinitely, draining Russian resources. If you are a Russian strategist, your logic is simple. To win the war and ensure your security, you must sever the enemy's supply lines. Lviv is the Achilles heel of Ukrainian defense. As soon as Russian troops reach the Polish border or establish tight fire control over transport arteries in the Mostyska area, organized resistance in the central and eastern parts of the country will become impossible. This is not a question of symbolism or a desire to capture the soul of the West, as some analysts call it. This is pure military necessity. In a world where might makes right, control over logistics is equivalent to control over the outcome of the war. However, here we encounter a fundamental security dilemma. Any action by Russia aimed at increasing its own security, in this case, advancing toward Lviv, is inevitably perceived by Western powers, and especially Poland, as a direct threat to their security. When Russian flags appear 70 kilometers from the Polish border, Warsaw will face an impossible choice. Poland, driven by fear of a historical repetition of Russian expansion, will experience colossal pressure to intervene directly. We already see that in 2026, the Polish leadership is actively discussing plans for so-called peacekeeping missions. But let us call things by their proper names. This is an attempt to create a buffer zone and prevent the total collapse of the pro-Western order in the region. The problem here lies in the fact that such an intervention by Poland may occur without a clear NATO mandate. And here lies the most dangerous moment for global stability. If Polish troops enter into direct contact with Russian units in the suburbs of Lviv, a situation will arise that will be extremely difficult for the US to control. The US, as the hegemon in the Western Hemisphere and an offshore balancer in Europe, has always strived to prevent the emergence of a single dominant player in Eurasia, but at the same time, the US fears a direct nuclear clash with Russia. If Warsaw begins a private initiative in Lviv, Article 5 of the Alliance's charter may not trigger automatically, as this would be an act of aggressive intervention on the territory of a third country. Moscow understands this perfectly and will use this split within NATO to paralyze the collective will of the West. Now let us turn to military strategy. A direct assault on such a large and historically complex city as Lviv would be madness. It would require the concentration of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and lead to colossal losses comparable to operations of the Second World War. But modern Russia in 2026 acts differently. Instead of frontal attacks, we see a strategy of indirect actions. The use of the territory of Belarus as a strategic balcony allows it to loom over all of western Ukraine. A strike from the direction of Lutsk and Kovel with the aim of cutting railways is what will deprive Lviv of its significance without the need to enter residential neighborhoods. If you turn the city into an island, cut off from supply, its fall becomes merely a matter of time and political bargaining. For the US, the situation in Lviv is a waking nightmare. Washington understands that Ukraine is effectively losing the war of attrition. The loss of Lviv would mean the final collapse of American strategy in Eastern Europe, which has been built over the last 30 years. This would be a geopolitical defeat on a scale exceeding the withdrawal from Afghanistan. In the corridors of power in 2026, conversations are already underway about secret deals. Realism tells us that great powers often make agreements behind the backs of small states when the stakes become too high. Is a scenario possible in which the U.S. agrees to Russian control over Lviv in exchange for certain guarantees of the non-spread of the conflict to NATO territory? In the world of hard politics, this is not just possible, it is probable. At the same time, we must not forget about other regional players, such as Hungary and Romania. They behave as classic rational actors pursuing their national interests in conditions of the weakening central power in Kyiv. If Russia begins the Lviv operation, Viktor Orban will likely introduce troops into Transcarpathia under the pretext of protecting ethnic Hungarians. This will create a situation of the total disintegration of Ukrainian statehood, where every neighbor takes their share. For NATO, this will become the ultimate humiliation. Alliance allies will effectively participate in the partition of territory they promised to protect. The economic aspect also plays against the West. In 2026, Europe is in a state of deep crisis. The militarization of the economy, caused by the need to oppose Russia, lays a heavy burden on the budgets of Germany and France. Is the German voter ready to sacrifice their well-being so that Lviv remains part of Ukraine, rather than becoming a Russian zone of influence? The answer is likely negative. As soon as Russian troops cut the transport hubs, an unprecedented migration wave of 5 to 7 million people will arise. This will paralyze the European social system and bring to power right-wing forces that will demand immediate reconciliation with Moscow on any terms. Russia uses this managed chaos as an instrument of pressure. For the Kremlin, access to Lviv is not only a military goal, but also a powerful lever for changing the entire security architecture in Europe. Moscow wants to return to a system of spheres of influence, where great powers decide the fates of regions based on their security interests, not liberal illusions. The fall of Lviv, or its blockade, will become that very moment of truth which will show that the era of American dominance in Europe has come to an end. Summarizing, one can say the following. Geography is destiny. Lviv is positioned such that it inevitably becomes an object of struggle as soon as Russia decides to restore its status as a great power. In 2026, we see that the technical and strategic capabilities for a Russian operation exist. The main question lies in how far the U.S. is ready to go in its support. And will Lviv not become that very point where great powers prefer a cynical partition of the world to total nuclear destruction? The old world order is truly bursting at the seams, and what happens on these western frontiers will define the structure of international relations for a decade ahead. In this game, there is no place for morality. There is only the balance of power, interests, and cold calculation, which ultimately dictates the course of history. We must be ready for the map of Europe to be redrawn again, because, in an anarchic world where there is no world government, the security of one state is always achieved at the expense of another. And Lviv today is the chessboard on which the endgame of a dangerous drama is being played out. If we continue our analysis, delving into the details of military planning and political risks, it becomes clear that the situation around Lviv in 2026 did not arise out of nowhere. It is the result of a decade of ignoring Russia's security interests by the West. When a great power says that a certain territory is a red line for it, ignoring this means heading toward catastrophe. The U.S. made a fundamental mistake in believing that they could endlessly expand their sphere of influence without meeting resistance. Now, when Russian troops are in a position allowing them to threaten Lviv, we see the payment for this arrogance. Let us consider the position of Belarus in more detail. In 2026, Minsk has effectively become part of a single defense space with Russia. The use of Belarusian territory for a strike on western Ukraine is a strategic maneuver that changes the entire equation. The distance from the border to Lviv via the highway through Lutsk is less than 250 kilometers. For a modern army possessing air superiority and electronic warfare capabilities, this is a traversable distance. The goal here is not the occupation of every square meter, but the destruction of the enemy's ability to wage war. Cutting the E40 highway and railway tracks in the area of Sarny and Kovel means that all aid from NATO will accumulate at the border, unable to reach the front. This creates a situation that game theory calls a zero-sum game. Any success for Russia is an absolute loss for the West. But for Europe, this loss also has social dimensions. I have already mentioned the migration collapse. Imagine 7 million refugees panicking and trying to cross the Polish border within a few days. This is not just a humanitarian catastrophe, it is a weapon of mass social destruction. Poland, despite all its bellicose rhetoric, will not be able to cope with such a flow. This will lead to the closing of borders inside Europe itself, the collapse of the Schengen zone, and a sharp rise in internal tension in EU countries. Russia understands that chaos on NATO borders is the best way to force Western leaders to sit at the negotiating table. As for the US, their strategy of fighting to the last Ukrainian in 2026 faces the reality of depleted stockpiles. The arsenals of democracy are not infinite. If Russia decides on a dash to Lviv, the US will find itself in a situation where they will either have to introduce their own troops, which means a third world war, or admit defeat. A realistic look at Washington tells us that there sit people who, despite all their rhetoric, are very good at calculating risks. The death of American soldiers for a city in the west of Ukraine is not something that can be easily sold to the voter, especially in conditions of internal political division within the US itself. Therefore, the most likely scenario is what I call the diplomacy of coercion. Russia will use the threat of seizing Lviv as a tool to conclude a comprehensive deal. This deal may include the neutralization of the remaining part of Ukraine, the recognition of Russia's territorial acquisitions in the east, and the creation of a new arms control system in Europe. Lviv in this scheme could become either a demilitarized zone under international observation or, which is more likely, formally remain Ukrainian but effectively be under Moscow's tight control through security mechanisms. We must also consider the factor of Poland more deeply. Warsaw sees itself as the future leader of Eastern Europe, and for it, the appearance of Russia at its borders is a personal challenge. But is Poland ready to fight alone? Without the full support of the US and other NATO members, Polish intervention would be an act of desperation. In 2026, we may see a split within the alliance itself into a war party, led by Poland and the Baltic states, and a peace party represented by Germany, France, and Italy. This split is exactly what the Kremlin is betting on. As soon as the unity of the West is destroyed, Russia will be able to dictate its terms to each state individually. We live in an era of the return of great powers. The rules established after 1945 and after the end of the Cold War no longer work. Force is once again the main argument. Lviv is merely the scenery against which the struggle for a new world order unfolds. Whether this will be a world divided into spheres of influence or a world plunged into global conflict depends on how rationally the leaders in Moscow and Washington behave in the coming months. But one thing is certain: the old Ukraine as we knew it has ceased to exist, and its western borders are now being written not in Kyiv, but in the course of the clash of great power interests. The future of Lviv is the future of the entire European security system, and it looks extremely uncertain. I would like you to understand one important thing. Great powers have no permanent friends, they only have permanent interests. And when these interests collide in such a sensitive point as Lviv, the consequences are felt all over the world. Russia strives to restore the buffer it lost after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The US strives to preserve its leadership. Poland strives to survive and rise. In this struggle for power and security, moral arguments are merely a smokescreen. The real truth of life is that small states often become victims in the games of giants. And Lviv in 2026 is the brightest confirmation of this. By the end of 2026, we will likely see a denouement. Either it will be through a large-scale military clash that severs supply lines, or through a painful diplomatic compromise that leaves Lviv in a suspended state. But in any case, the world will never be the same again. The border between East and West is shifting again, and it runs along the cobblestones of Lviv streets. This is the reality with which we all have to live. And the sooner we discard illusions, the better we will be able to understand the dangerous times we have entered. Should I add that the role of personality in history is also great here? The decisions made by Putin and U.S. leaders are based on their perception of threat and their understanding of national interest. In 2026, these perceptions diverge radically. For Russia, the lack of control over Ukraine's western borders is an open wound. For the U.S., maintaining this control is a symbol of their global dominance. When two such powerful impulses collide, finding a compromise is extremely difficult. But it is precisely the need to avoid a nuclear apocalypse that may become the single factor that forces them to agree. Lviv in this game is the most expensive piece on the board, and its loss or preservation will determine the winner in this match. Everything we have discussed, from logistics to migration flows, from Hungary's position to secret deals between the US and Moscow, boils down to one thing. The balance of power in Europe has radically changed, and those who continue to believe in old history, textbooks, and international law risk ending up on the sidelines of this new reality. We must look at things as they are, not as we would like to see them. And the reality is this: Lviv is in the crosshairs of Russian geopolitics, and the consequences of this will be felt far beyond Eastern Europe. Continuing the reasoning, it is worth paying attention to how the internal political situation in the U.S. affects their ability to project power in the Lviv region. In 2026, American society is deeply divided, and the question of why billions should be spent on defending a city in Eastern Europe becomes increasingly acute. Isolationist sentiments are growing, and any president in the White House is forced to reckon with this. This gives Russia an additional window of opportunity. If Moscow senses that Washington's resolve is wavering, a strike on the Lviv direction will become practically inevitable. At the same time, one cannot underestimate the technological aspect of the war. In 2026, we are talking about the massive use of drones, high-precision weapons, and space reconnaissance assets. This means that any movement of troops becomes transparent. It is impossible to hide preparations for a dash to Lviv. Consequently, if Russia begins this operation, it will not be a sudden attack, but a deliberate challenge thrown to the entire West. It will be a statement: we are ready for escalation, are you? And here we return again to the question of will and resources. Who will turn out to have more of them at the decisive moment? Europe, deprived of cheap energy resources from Russia and forced to spend huge funds on defense, is in an extremely vulnerable position. The growth in popularity of right-wing movements in France and Germany testifies to the fact that Europeans are tired of the role of hostages in the conflict of great powers. If Lviv ends up under siege, we may see mass protests in European capitals demanding an end to support for Ukraine and the normalization of relations with Russia. This will create a situation where NATO governments will be paralyzed not only by external pressure from Moscow, but also by the internal discontent of their citizens. Thus, Lviv in 2026 is not just a point on the map. It is a test of the viability of the entire Western system. If the West cannot hold its gates, this will mean the end of the American century in Europe. For Russia, this is a chance to restore historical justice as they understand it and ensure a decade of security from NATO's advance to the east. This is a struggle not for territory, but for status, for the right to define the rules of the game. And in this struggle, as I've already said, the winner is the one who is ready to go to the end and who better understands the laws of realism. Developing this thought further, we must realize that in 2026, the strategic significance of Lviv goes far beyond simple control over railway tracks and highways. We are dealing with what I call the ultimate test of the theory of offshore balancing. For the US, Ukraine has always been a useful tool for containing Russia, but it has never been a vital interest for which it is worth risking Chicago or New York in a nuclear exchange. When Russian troops begin an operation to cut off the western regions, they effectively put the question squarely before Washington. Are you ready to materialize your promises when the price becomes exorbitant? In conditions of an anarchic international system, states act based on worst-case scenarios. Russia assumes that if it does not take control of the Lviv hub, the US will sooner or later use it to deploy medium-range missile systems, which will reduce the flight time to Moscow to a few minutes. From the Kremlin's point of view, this is unacceptable. Therefore, the strategy of deep envelopment that we observe in 2026 is aimed not at the occupation of Lviv in the classical sense, with commandants' offices and patrols on every street, but at turning it into a dysfunctional dead end. If you destroy the substations providing traction for electric locomotives, if you destroy bridges across the Dniester and block tunnels in the Carpathians, Lviv turns from an asset into a burden. Instead of being an artery for Western weapons, it becomes a trap for hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and millions of civilians who need to be fed and provided for, but who no longer have a connection with the outside world. Let us look at this from the position of Poland. In 2026, Warsaw is in a state of strategic hysteria. In the Polish political establishment, the idea dominates that if Russia takes Lviv, then the next will be Lublin or even Warsaw. This is a classic illustration of the security dilemma. Russia wants to secure itself by creating a buffer, and Poland sees this as preparation for aggression against itself. But here cold numbers come into play. Poland's military potential, despite massive purchases of American tanks and Korean aircraft, is insufficient to wage a full-scale conventional war with Russia without direct U.S. support. In 2026, we see Washington beginning to send signals of restraint to Warsaw. American strategists understand that if the Polish army crosses the border and enters the Lviv region, Russia may use tactical nuclear weapons to demonstrate resolve. And what will the U.S. do then? Will they respond against Russian targets, causing global Armageddon? Most likely not. Realism tells us that great powers prefer to sacrifice the interests of a small ally to avoid their own destruction. This brings us to an analysis of what is happening inside Ukraine itself. In 2026, political unity in Kyiv begins to crack under the weight of military failures. When Lviv ends up under threat, the country's Western elites begin to ask themselves about the expediency of continuing the struggle. A phenomenon arises that we have seen repeatedly in history. When central power weakens, regional identities come to the fore. Lviv has always been a stronghold of a specific Ukrainian nationalism, distinct from the eastern regions. If Moscow offers Lviv the status of a sort of free city or demilitarized autonomy under an unspoken Russian protectorate in exchange for a ceasefire, this may find a response among part of the local elite who wants to save the city from destruction. In international politics, such deals seem immoral, but they are a standard tool for ending wars of attrition. Let us also consider the position of Germany and France. By 2026, the economic locomotive of Europe has finally slowed down. German industry suffers from high energy prices, and French society is gripped by internal unrest. For Berlin and Paris, the fall of Lviv is of course a geopolitical defeat, but at the same time, it is a long-awaited excuse to end the conflict. They will use the threat of Russia capturing Lviv as a pretext to force Ukraine to accept territorial realities. We will see a return to the logic of the concert of nations of the 19th century, where great powers agree on borders without asking the opinion of those across whose territory these borders pass. This is a cruel reality, and those who believe in a rules-based order simply close their eyes to how the world actually functions. Special attention should be paid to the role of China. In 2026, Beijing is closely watching the situation around Lviv. For China, this is an ideal experiment. If the U.S. cannot protect its interests in such a critical point of Europe, this will become a signal to Beijing that American guarantees regarding Taiwan or the South China Sea are not worth the paper they are written on. Russia and China act in tandem to stretch U.S. resources. While Washington racks its brain over how to save logistics in Lviv, China can increase pressure in the Pacific. This creates strategic overload for the American leadership. In a world where resources are always fewer than ambitions, the U.S. will have to choose which region is more important for them. And I suspect that in the long term, they will choose Asia, leaving Lviv and all of Ukraine to the care of Moscow and its European neighbors. Now let us analyze the tactical situation. In 2026, the Russian army has significantly evolved. We no longer see long columns of armored vehicles vulnerable to ambushes. Instead, Russia uses the concept of a reconnaissance strike contour on a new level. Lviv is under constant surveillance by hundreds of satellites and long-endurance drones. Any attempt to transfer a significant volume of equipment across the Polish border is interdicted within 15 minutes. This means that the gates of the West are not just closed, they are mined with high-precision weapons. In such conditions, supporting the Ukrainian grouping in Lviv becomes impossible. This does not require the physical presence of a Russian soldier on every street of the city. It is enough that the city is completely paralyzed technically. This creates what I call a state of strategic paralysis. The U.S. cannot increase aid because it does not reach the addressee. Ukraine cannot continue the war because it is running out of ammunition and fuel that previously went through Lviv. Poland cannot intervene because it fears being left one-on-one with a nuclear power. In this situation, time works for Russia. Moscow can afford to wait until the fruits of victory fall into its hands by themselves. In 2026, the Russian leadership understands that a decisive victory in Lviv is not the storming of buildings, but the destruction of the West's will to resist. As soon as Western capitals understand that Lviv is lost as a logistical center, they will begin to compete with each other for the right to be the first to call the Kremlin. We must also consider the factor of Hungary in 2026. Budapest behaves extremely pragmatically. Viktor Orban understands that the collapse of the current order is an opportunity to return influence in Transcarpathia. If Russian troops approach Lviv, Hungary will likely announce the creation of a humanitarian corridor or security zone to protect ethnic Hungarians. This will create another level of complexity for NATO. Will the alliance have to introduce sanctions against its own member for effectively helping Russia divide Ukraine? This will show the absolute impotence of the collective institutions of the West. In an anarchic world, everyone is for themselves, and the example of Hungary in 2026 will become contagious for other neighbors of Ukraine. Many liberal analysts say that Russia will never be able to digest Western Ukraine due to the hostility of the population. But they are mistaken about one thing. Russia does not need to digest Lviv. It needs it to cease being a threat. In 2026, we may see a model in which Galicia turns into a kind of buffer republic with minimal sovereignty, cut off from a military alliance with the West. This will be a solution in the spirit of the 19th century, which will ensure Russia peace on its western frontiers for the next 50 years. For Moscow, this is worth any cost, because at stake is the very survival of the Russian state in the form in which it is understood in the Kremlin. If we look at demographics, the situation in 2026 looks even gloomier for supporters of fighting to the end. A huge part of the population has already left the country. The people remaining in Lviv are mainly those who have nowhere to run, or those who hope for a miracle. When a miracle in the form of American aircraft carriers in the Black Sea or Polish divisions on the streets of the city does not happen, deep apathy sets in. This apathy is Russia's best ally. A society that has lost hope for victory is ready to accept any order just so the shelling stops and electricity returns. In 2026, Russian propaganda will actively exploit this thesis, offering stability in exchange for loyalty. Summarizing this segment of the analysis, I want to emphasize that Lviv is not only a military target, it is a symbol. For Russia, it is a symbol of the final expulsion of the West from its historical sphere of influence. For the U.S., it is a symbol of the limit of their power. In 2026, we see how this symbol changes owners. This is not an accident and not the mistake of one person. This is the result of the inexorable laws of geopolitics, where force always seeks equilibrium. The balance of power in Eastern Europe has for a long time been artificially shifted toward the West, and now the pendulum has swung back. It is also important to understand the economic background of this drama. In 2026, the U.S. faces the necessity of financing several crises at once, from competition with China to internal infrastructure problems. Allocating another $100 billion to hold Lviv becomes political suicide for any administration. At the same time, Russia has transferred its economy to a war footing and learned to live under sanctions. In this war of attrition, the winner is the one who has a lower pain threshold and higher readiness for sacrifice. Russia traditionally has this threshold much higher than Western democracies. For the Russian leadership, control over Lviv is a question of the security of the regime in the country. For the American leadership, it is a question of a line in a history textbook. Obviously, who in this situation will show greater persistence? We must also consider that in 2026, the global majority, the BRICS countries, the global South, does not support the West in its desire to maintain the status quo in Ukraine. For India, Brazil, or South Africa, the struggle for Lviv is an internal affair of Europe in which they do not see their interest. Moreover, many of them are interested in weakening American hegemony. This leaves the US in diplomatic isolation that was difficult to imagine even 10 years ago. When Washington talks about protecting democracy in Lviv, the rest of the world sees this as an attempt to preserve old dominance, and this only strengthens Russia's position. Thus, if we add up all these factors, Russia's military superiority in the theater of operations, the logistical vulnerability of Lviv, the political split in the US and Europe, Poland's determination, Hungary's pragmatism, as well as global changes in the distribution of power, we get a picture of the inevitable transformation of the region. In 2026, Lviv ceases to be a Western outpost and becomes the subject of a great bargain. And in this bargain, Russia holds all the trump cards. This does not mean that the process will be easy or bloodless. On the contrary, it will be accompanied by huge upheavals. But the logic of realism is inexorable. When a great power feels a threat at its doorstep, it will do everything to eliminate this threat, and no words about international law will stop it. Ultimately, we must look at the situation in Lviv as a prelude to a new security architecture. After 2026, Europe will be divided by new lines that will more accurately reflect the real balance of power rather than the liberal dreams of the 90s. This will be a world in which the US will have to share influence with other players, and Russia will be returned its role as a key factor in European politics. Lviv in this new reality will become either a quiet province in the East's sphere of influence or a demilitarized shadow of its past. And this is the best outcome one can hope for in conditions where the alternative is a total clash of great powers. We must be ready for news from Lviv in 2026 to shock the Western public. There will be calls for decisive actions, new sanctions packages will be adopted. But behind all this noise will hide the quiet work of diplomats who are already now, I am sure, drawing new borders on maps. Realism teaches us that peace is not the absence of conflicts, but the ability of great powers to manage these conflicts so as not to allow mutual destruction. In the case of Lviv, this management means recognizing that Russia has a right to its security interests, however unpleasant they may seem Washington or Brussels. The tragedy of Ukraine and Lviv, in particular, is the tragedy of a state that believed in the promise of external protection in a world where everyone protects only themselves. In 2026, this lesson is learned at too high a price, but for the rest of the world, it is a reminder that geography and force remain the primary factors of international politics. Lviv is the chess square on which the era of unipolarity ends. And how exactly it ends will determine the character of the international order for the entire 21st century. We must look at this process without illusions, with a cold mind and an understanding that great powers will always act as their nature dictates, striving for power and security in an infinitely dangerous world. Considering further prospects, we cannot ignore the fact that in 2026, the information space has also become a battlefield. The US attempts to create an image of Lviv as an impregnable fortress of spirit, but military reality dictates otherwise. When Russian long-range strike capabilities begin to systematically destroy fuel and lubricant warehouses and repair bases in the vicinity of the city, no slogans can make tanks move. This is the material world, and in it, the winner is the one who has more resources and better organized logistics. Russia in 2026 has the advantage of an internal line of operations. It can transfer troops and resources within its territory much faster and more effectively than the West can deliver them across the ocean and through all of Europe. Furthermore, it is worth mentioning the nuclear factor in more detail. In 2026, Russia updated its nuclear doctrine, lowering the threshold for the use of weapons of mass destruction in the event of a threat to the very existence of the state. From the Kremlin's point of view, the full integration of Western Ukraine into the NATO structure is precisely such a threat. When Russian officials speak of a sanitary zone in the Lviv area, they are not joking. They are making it clear to the U.S. that any attempt to create a permanent Western military base there will be met with all available means. In Washington, they understand this, and that is precisely why we do not see readiness for direct intervention there. This is a classic example of deterrence in action. On this note, I conclude my deep analysis. We have examined all factors from military logistics to high diplomacy, from Poland's interests to internal U.S. problems. The picture emerging is alarming, but extremely clear for anyone who looks at the world without rose-colored glasses. We are on the eve of great upheavals, and Lviv will become the place where the fate of Europe and possibly the whole world in the 21st century will be decided. It remains for us only to watch closely how the great powers will play their cards in this deadly endgame.